Charles-Émile, Pinto Colvig, Quirino Cristiani. You might not know their names or the projects they've made, but their impact they've left on the world of filmmaking is nothing short of legendary. These people all have one thing in common. They were some of the first to create a feature-length movie with the then rapidly growing art of animation. While animated films from companies like Disney are considered successful classics today, just a little over a century ago, animation was even more of a taxing process than it is now. Making an animated short that was only a few minutes long was already hard enough, let alone making an entire feature-length film before the process was efficient enough to be viable for something of that length. Yet all around the world, these filmmakers strive to push the limits that animation brought from the 1890s all the way up until the 1930s. With limited budgets and dedicated teams, they went crazy with their imaginations. They made animated films with cutouts of people's heads put on animated characters, spoofs of Argentinian political leaders, funny beer antics, and even a lively circus. And at that time in cinema history, they all succeeded in the then new field of animation. But why don't we hear their names being touted as the creators of the first feature-length animations? The sad truth about these creators' films is due to their lack of preservation over the past century, whether intentional or unintentional, they have almost all become lost in the sands of time. Quite a tragic fate for these pieces of animation history. Last time, we covered a lost show that was historic to the medium of television itself, but now it's time we jump to the silver screen to finally give several of these historic lost animated treasures the attention they deserve. And maybe we can focus on the fun stories of the people who made them along the way as well. So grab your French beer, overthrow the Argentine government, and throw all your films into the Seine River to look at the lost legacy of the first animated feature films. Actually, maybe don't do that last thing. Our journey into the early history of feature-length animation starts in 1888 with a Frenchman named Charles-Émile. Born on December 8, 1844, Mr. Reynaud learned quite a few of his crafts at an early age. He was taught painting and drawing skills by his mother, and by the age of 13, he was building small-scale steam engines. As an adult, he would take to the field of photography and optical lens technology, where he would eventually get his connection to the development of the early film and eventually the early animation industry. In 1877, he would invent and patent the praxinoscope, an archaic animation device that honestly sounds like something the doctor would use when you get a nasty infection. It was similar to previous animation devices, with pictures that were placed on a spinning cylinder that created the illusion of movement while it spins. The big change, however, was that the images were viewed through mirrors on the device, instead of small viewing holes like on previous animation devices. This allowed for the praxinoscope to display brighter and smoother animations than other animation devices. Now let's fast forward to the year 1888, where Reynaud would patent yet another animation device called the Théâtre Optique, or optical theater. The Théâtre Optique was actually quite similar to the praxinoscope before it, but on a much grander scale both in the animations that used it and the mass amount of publicity it got. While it wasn't the first animation projection device, it certainly was the most advanced at the time. In oversimplified terms, the way that the Théâtre Optique worked is that the film reel would move back and forth between two spools of film made of gelatin on the device, similar to a cassette tape. Reynaud would then manually change the speed and repeat frames, and project the animated images onto a screen using mirrors. The optical theater could display animated films that could be more than 10 minutes long, which of course was revolutionary at a time when most animations looked like looping GIFs if anything. It even was the first known use of film perforations, aka those little holes you see on the edges of film strips. It's fair to say that the Théâtre Optique was also the first big and successful animation show produced. Between 1892 and 1900, Reynaud would give shows featuring the optical theater at the Musée Grévin in Paris, featuring some of the first animated feature films that were hand-painted by Reynaud himself. Well, I use the term feature films very loosely, as the films that use the Théâtre Optique only ran in upwards of 15 minutes. However, it's still important to discuss them in this video, because these early animated features are still important from both an animation history perspective as well as a lost media perspective. And trust me, we'll get to these films' tragic fate. But anyways, between 1892 and 1900, the show would amass a whopping 500,000 visitors. Quite a hefty number for the new and experimental medium that was animation. But what were these films that were drawing these audiences from all around the world? The features that Mr. Reynaud hand-painted for his newfangled Théâtre Optique system. And most importantly to our humble video, how exactly did these important pieces of film history become lost to the ages? Let's answer these questions by taking a look at Charles-Émile Reynaud's animated films made for the Théâtre Optique one by one. It's fitting that we kick things off with Reynaud's first animated film created for the Théâtre Optique, Un bon bock, translated into English as a good beer. The film involves a quote-unquote wanderer walking into a bar and ordering a beer from a pretty waitress. The pretty waitress then comes back with the beer, but then someone swoops in and drinks it. It turns out that this is actually the cook, because this is apparently one of those fancy bar and grill places like Applebee's that gives you a 5% higher chance of giving you a stroke while you are there. The wanderer, now confused on why his first beer is gone, asks for another one. We then see an English traveler walk in and somehow embarrasses the wanderer. They get into a fight, and then the cook swoops in again and drinks the second beer. When the wanderer comes back and sees that the second beer was drinking, he expresses his disappointment with the bar and furiously walks out. The cook then explains to the waitress that the beer drinking was his doing, and they both have a good chuckle at the wanderer walking out of the bar. Un bon bock would premiere alongside two other films using the Théâtre Optique system on October 28, 1892, at an event branded under the name Pantomime Lumineuse. It was painted in 1888 and was made up of 700 pictures that were individually painted by Reynaud himself. Yeah, it's fair to say that the animation in these films was quite limited to say the least. On-screen movement was rare and the characters would move quite slowly. As expected, no footage of this early animated film is known to exist, which will become a constant theme throughout the Théâtre Optique films as well as this video in general. Only a few promotional posters and a detailed description of the plot remain of this film. Reynaud's second film made for the Théâtre Optique, Le Clown et ses chiens, translated into English as The Clown and His Dogs, involves funny clown and dog antics. It starts off with a clown walking into a circus ring and starts performing tricks with three poodles. They walk on a ball, jump through hoops, and play with a wand. And that's it. A fairly straightforward film with a fairly straightforward premise. The film would premiere alongside Un bon bock and one other film at the same Pantomime Lumineuse event on October 28, 1892. It was made up of 300 individually painted pictures and ran for approximately 10 minutes. We actually have far less of this film than we do for Un bon bock, with only a single production sketch showing the clown and one of the dogs still remaining from this long-lost film. Pauvre Pierrot, roughly translating to Poor Pete, is Reynaud's third film made for the Théâtre Optique and the last of the three movies to originally premiere at the opening Pantomime Lumineuse show. It's a film that involves many of the stock characters from Commedia dell'arte, good old Italian comedy theater. It was painted in 1891 and is made up of around 500 individually painted pictures. This feature involves three characters, the titular Pierrot, Harlequin, and Colombina. One evening, Harlequin goes over to see his beloved Colombina. However, they both hear a knock at the door, and it turns out that this is actually the crazy clown Pierrot. While Harlequin hides, Colombina stays outside while Pierrot does something. During this, Harlequin hides behind a post and messes around with Pierrot. He pokes at him with a stick and steals his bottle, but eventually Pierrot has enough and leaves, with Harlequin and Colombina going back in the house as the film ends. Now, I'm not that familiar with the historical context behind Italian theater or this specific story, so I'm sorry if that plot summary may have been a bit incorrect in some places. Now let me brace myself for all the comments I get saying I got everything wrong or how I pronounced something weird. Pauvre Pierrot is unique in the fact that it is the first film mentioned so far to be partially surviving, technically making it the first partially surviving animated feature. 4 minutes out of this approximately 15-minute film currently survive and are publicly available to watch on your local Wikipedia page. Despite being the first animated feature to be at least partially surviving, it really is kind of disappointing since that the footage that is available doesn't have much in terms of context to it. This makes it really weird for me to watch going into this with little prior knowledge of the source material. It really does feel like you are missing a huge piece of the puzzle for these films and their history, which makes sense because, well, they're lost. After the success of the first 3 films shown as a part of the Pantomime Lumineuse event in the early 1890s, it's no wonder that Charles-Émile-Reynaud would sit down to make yet another animated feature for the Théâtre Optique. So in 1893, he would produce Autour d'une cabine, or Around a Cabin as it is known in English. It's also known as this bulky title that I won't even bother to pronounce, which roughly translates to Around a Cabin or Misadventures of a Couple at the Seaside. What a name! We start with a shot of a beach with a diving board and 2 beach huts, and then see a few people jump into the water from a diving board. A woman is then shown coming out of one of the beach huts, who is shown playing with a small dog. A man then comes out of the same beach hut and they partake in some tomfoolery and, dare I say, trolling on the beach. They then both get changed into bathing suits and swim in the water for a bit. The feature ends with someone sailing into the scene with a sailboat bearing the message La représentation est terminée, meaning the performance is over. Autour d'une cabine would become part of the rotating shows of the Pantomime Lumineuse event starting in December of 1894. It premiered with an original runtime of around 15 minutes and 636 individually painted pictures, though only a 1-minute cut of the film still exists and is readily available today. What's strange, however, is that there seems to be 2 completely different music tracks for the film. You see, one thing we really haven't touched on so far with Reynaud's films is the music score, all of which are credited to a man named Gaston Paulin. Autour d'une cabine seems to have 2 copies floating around online with completely different music scores, one of which is sourced from a regular YouTube upload, and another which is sourced from a short documentary on the Théâtre Optique that I will link in the description for those who are interested. While I can't confirm nor deny that the documentary overlaid different music entirely, it still brings up an interesting possibility that there were 2 separate music scores made for this feature. It's fair to say that the Théâtre Optique's first 4 animated features were a huge success both technologically and financially. This meant that Reynaud could finally benefit from it and experiment and tinker around with the Théâtre Optique a wee bit more to realize the full potential of the system in the late 1890s. This would lead him to create 3 more films with a device called the Photo-Cinegrapher. This was a device developed in 1895 by Reynaud that allowed for animated photographs to be taken and used for the Théâtre Optique. It was similar to another device called the chronophotograph, invented by French scientists Étienne Jules Marais. The way chronophotography worked was that a series of images would be taken in rapid succession with a specific type of camera, and these frames could be put together and studied further. While this type of photography was usually applied to scientific fields such as the study of locomotion, its potential was seen as an early form to make moving pictures. One of these people who saw this potential was our good friend Mr. Reynaud, who wanted to apply the technology of chronophotography to the optical theater. So he would develop the Photo-Cinegrapher, and made 3 animated films for the device between 1896 and 1898 under the brand Photo-Peintures animées, or animated photo paintings. Instead of taking pictures of paintings, these films would be shot in 16 frames per second, with key frames being hand-picked and made into a gelatin strip to be played back on the Théâtre Optique. Voila! You got yourself a snazzy animated photo painting. The first film Reynaud would make using this technology was Guillaume Tell, or William Tell in English. Produced in April 1896 and premiering as a part of the Pantomime Lumineuse lineup in August of that same year, this feature starred the 2 famous French clowns Foutit and Chocolat. They would be shown performing a little skit where Chocolat has an apple on his head and bites a small piece off. Meanwhile, Footed pulls out a gun and whoa, put that thing down. That's not very YouTube friendly. But don't be alarmed everyone, because it's simply just a water gun. I guess you could say that these 2 were clowning around, am I right? Pardon my terrible clown jokes, please. Unfortunately, only 1 frame of Guillaume Tell featuring the 2 characters is all that survives of this film. The second film Reynaud would make using this technology was Le Premiere Cigar, or the first cigar as it is known in English. Produced in 1896 and premiering as a part of the Pantomime Lumineuse lineup in July 1897, this film stars French actor Félix Galipo. Dressed as a schoolboy, he faces probably one of the most 1890s problems ever, the anxiety that comes when smoking your first cigar. Because everyone did that back in the ye old days. Not much seems to still exist from this film. No screenshots, no video, only that brief plot description I just mentioned. Our third and final film, a part of the animated Photo-Peintures, brings us to 1898, where Reynaud would produce his final film for the Théâtre Optique, Le Clown Price, translated to English as The Clown's Price. This is by far the most obscure of the Théâtre Optique films, as to my knowledge, not even a morsel of a plot description is readily available anywhere. According to the knowledge hub we call Wikipedia, the film apparently starred the clowns of the Alhambra Maurice Chevalier Music Hall in France, but there's no way I can confirm this as 100% fact. What we do know is that this film would be flat out cancelled. It never premiered at the Pantomime Lumineuse event, or anywhere else for that matter. According to Reynaud, this film was the first to take advantage of what he called a continuous projector with an oscillating mirror. Unfortunately, he never seemed to get a satisfactory result from the system, so he just ended up scrapping it along with Le Clown Price. And that's all of Emile-Reynaud's films that would be produced for the Théâtre Optique. These features would continue to be shown at the Pantomime Lumineuse event for quite a while, even after more advanced motion picture technology came about in the mid to late 1890s from grand inventors such as the Lumiere brothers. However, once technology caught up to the then almost decade-old optical theater system, the event would have its grand finale in March 1900. A solid 8-year run for one of the biggest breakthroughs in not just animation history, but just general film history as a whole. But why are many of these animated treasures lost to time, never to be seen again? I mean, you would think that since these films are so undoubtedly important to animation and film history, they would be preserved for the rest of time. Yet as we mentioned, not much still exists from most of Reynaud's features. In a twist of fate, both Reynaud and his Théâtre Optique would meet a tragic fate going into the 20th century. After the optical theater show at the Musée Grévin ended its run, there really wasn't much use for the technology in the films that used it. Motion picture technology was rapidly advancing past the days of the Théâtre Optique, and Reynaud didn't see the impact that his films had. Seeing his optical theater system outdated and forgotten by the general public, and facing a lack of money and depression, Reynaud destroyed his last Théâtre Optique system and most of his irreplaceable film work by throwing them into the Seine River. The only two films of his to not be destroyed were Pauvre Pierrot and Autour d'une cabine. He would live out the rest of his life poor until passing away on the banks of the Seine River on January 9th, 1918. To end this part of the video on a positive note, Charles-Émile Reynaud will forever be one of the biggest innovators in not just animation history, but film history as a whole. He opened the floodgates for animated films, at a time where animation was relegated to a looping image much of the time. While much of his films may be lost forever, his name will forever be tied to the history of animation and the inventions he made for it. And that's a legacy I hope never becomes lost. Even after the Théâtre Optique, the future of animated films was looking bright. It seemed that in the near future, someone, somewhere would make the first animated feature film. Yet for that future, we would have to wait another decade and a half. Time is a living, breathing process, so let's jump forward to 1915 to look at one man's great creation. In the mid-1910s, a man named Pinto Colvig along with a few others sat down to create what was likely the very first animated feature film. Well, you probably won't recognize Colvig at first. You might know his voice.
Come kids, come on. Get this place cleaned up. I gotta shave. Come on, hurry up. Don't stand there. Get moving. Shake a leg. Come on, now get going. Everybody ready?
Well, this is a pleasant surprise.
That's right, the first voice of iconic Disney characters such as Goofy and Pluto also created the first animated feature film. What a guy! And that film he created was simply titled Creation. Creation was a strange film to say the least. While not many specific plot details are known, from the resources that do survive, we can definitely tell that this film was off its rocker a wee bit. Cutouts of people's heads were placed onto characters, with these heads being animated in various ways to convey the majority of expressions. Also, considering the name of the film, can we just make an educated guess and say that the characters created something fantastical and whimsical leading to misadventures? It makes sense, considering one of the few existing frames shows two of the characters creating something at a desk. Again, much of these plot details are simple speculation. There isn't much in terms of detailed plot info online, so bear with me here. While Creation's inception can be credited to Pinto Colvig, 3 animators are also credited to working on the film: Angel Esboy, Tack Knight, and Byington Ford. All 3 of these people would go on to have successful careers in various fields. The film would be, dare I say, created by the Animated Film Corporation, an early animation studio based in San Francisco throughout the early to mid-1910s. The film would eventually be released in 1915 or 1916, there are conflicting sources on the exact year. As it stands, it currently remains the first known feature-length animated film, beating out the other film we'll talk about next by at least a year. Now, on the surface, Creation seems like quite the fun type of lost media. You see, the Animated Film Corporation would not last long after the film was completed. In 1917, the studio would shut its doors for good due to complications from the First World War. It's unknown what exactly happened to the film after the studio shut down or if any known copies still exist, though considering this movie is more than 100 years old, it's unlikely to say the least. The film wasn't even widely known online until a Reddit post about the film was made on r/Lost Media on January 15th, 2021, by my good friend user CP Cudrons-Doodles. The post reads, "So I need some help finding info about a lost animated film that predates El Apóstol by 2 years. It was made by Pinto Colvig, who later went on to voice Goofy. The film is lost besides 4 frames, but I can't even find those frames. If anybody knows anything about this, let me know." This kickstarted the then mostly unknown lost media hunt for Creation. OP would then contact the Southern Oregon Historical Society via email, who holds much of the info and archives of Pinto Colvig. They would eventually respond, pointing to a YouTube video with the 5 surviving frames of the film, which includes the title card, a frame from the film itself, Colvig working on the film, an advertisement from the 1960s mentioning the film, and a character sheet. We could now finally see this first animated feature film in some visual form for the first and likely only time ever. Again, it's crazy to think that such an important piece of cinema history can be completely forgotten and lost in centuries' time. Creation certainly was a creation, a historic one at that, but one that unfortunately doesn't have much info to its name publicly available to regurgitate back to you. In reality, the most interesting thing known about Creation is that it was made by the guy who voiced Goofy. I really wish I had more to say about this film, but unfortunately, my research has all but run dry. Whatever the case may be, the first feature-length animated creation will remain a mystery. We would not have to wait long for our next animated feature film, as one man from Argentina would just so happen to pick up the pace just a year and some change after Creation. Welcome to 1917, friends, where we meet Quirino Cristiani in the wacky world of the Argentine government told through groundbreaking animated feature films. Let's now focus our story and progression of the first animated feature films on a small Argentine cartoonist named Quirino Cristiani. Born on July 2nd, 1896 in Italy, Cristiani would move to Argentina in 1900 and get his start drawing cartoons as a teenager, mainly being known for his political satire and caricatures that would make appearances in Argentine newspapers. However, the perfect opportunity for political satire would come up in 1916. On October 12, 1916, popular politician of the time Hipólito Yrigoyen would be elected as the new president of Argentina. While this guy was interesting and historic in many ways for Argentina, I wouldn't say I'm the most interested in talking about century-old Argentine politics. So for the purposes of this video, all you need to know is that he gave tons of freedom to the press, which of course meant that they were going to satirize the guy tons. Whether it was his social weirdness that would earn him the nickname Armadillo or his crazy corruption, the newspapers were always on his back for whatever the guy did. You know, typical political stuff. It was obvious to Cristiani, an Argentine political cartoonist, would jump on this bandwagon to satirize the president in his works. But he wanted to go bigger than a wee newspaper cartoon. He wanted to create a fully animated film. So in 1916, Cristiani would produce and release a 2.5-minute animated feature titled La Intervención en la Provincia de Buenos Aires, known in English as Intervention in the Province of Buenos Aires. It was produced as a segment of the Argentine newsreel Actualidades Vale. This short film revolved around Uruguayan going after the governor of Buenos Aires, Marcelino Ugarte, for dishonesty. This film is important for two reasons. Number one is that this would debut the cardboard cutout animation style that Cristiani would use and become known for the rest of his career. He would study animated films from icons such as Emile-Reynaud and put the techniques he learned into use in this film for the first time. Number two is that this was the film that strengthened the relationship between Cristiani and Italian-born director Federico Vell. Vell had done camera work on many early documentary films in the past, including being the first known person to film aerial cinematography. He had also come to Buenos Aires from Italy and was quite impressed by Cristiani's work. While he wasn't very interested in political satire himself, he knew that the Argentine people and Cristiani were, so they would both raise money to create one of the first animated feature films ever produced, a satire of Uruguayan like no other. And on November 9th, 1917, Cristiani would introduce to the world El Apóstol, or simply the Apostle in English. The underlying plot of El Apóstol involves Uruguayan dreaming of wanting to cleanse the city of Buenos Aires of corruption and poor morals. He ascends to the heavens, talking about the problems in the city with the gods. He eventually encounters Zeus and asks him for lightning bolts to help wipe the city clean of bad morals. You know, like the BBC television archives in the 1950s. Lightning bolts then rain down from the sky, engulfing the city in flames, then rebuilding it because plot progression. Woo. Uruguayan then awakes, realizing it was all a dream, and the film ends. These films only get crazier, don't they? El Apóstol was animated with 58,000 animated pictures, running at 14 frames per second and clocking in with a runtime of 70 minutes. Character designs were drawn by popular Argentine cartoonist Diogenes El Mundo Taborda, although it was up to Cristiani to fully animate the characters into the film through cutout animation. This was quite an impressive film from a technical standpoint at the time, and it seemed to pay off in the end. The film was quite successful both critically and commercially, considering it was a film that could really only appeal to the Buenos Aires market. It may actually have ended up being too successful, as when the Buenos Aires City Council found out about the politically charged contents of the movie, they voted to ban it entirely. Despite this overwhelming success, Cristiani only earned 1,000 pesos from the film, equivalent to around $9.50 in US currency. A fairly small amount even for the time, considering Cristiani directed the film. Alas, Federico Vell was the one who took the majority of the money made. I guess it's also important to note that Cristiani would cut ties with Vell after this movie because of this money fiasco. Unfortunately, El Apóstol, along with Cristiani's other animated films, have become lost, and no copies are known to exist due to their poor preservation. All of Cristiani's films would be destroyed in fires, with El Apóstol along with Cristiani's next film being engulfed by a fire in Federico Vell's studio in 1926. All that remains are a few character designs and a few pictures of production assets. Despite the money issues behind the scenes and the firing of the main producer behind the helm, Cristiani was not ready to give up yet on creating yet another feature-length animated film, and this time with no setbacks. So in 1918, Cristiani would release Sin Dejar Rastros, or Without a Trace in English. This film was a dramatization of the incident during the First World War where German commander Baron von Luxemburg would sink an Argentine ship and would try to frame the Entente, or the Allied powers, for the act. However, word does eventually get out about who carried the incident out, ruining the plan. Unfortunately for Cristiani, the film was nowhere near as successful as El Apóstol, and it eventually would be banned from even being shown again at the order of Hipólito Yrigoyen. These factors seem to put Cristiani out of the animation game, at least for a little while. No footage of this feature is known to exist either, as all known copies were destroyed in the same studio fire as El Apóstol in 1926. Only one confirmed image of the film still exists, depicting the crew on the boat. Now, as I said earlier, Cristiani would drop out of the animation game after the lackluster success of Sin Dejar Rastros. I guess feature-length animations were just too new and experimental to bank on for a successful career, and it was better to wait until animation in general got out of its more experimental stage. So Cristiani did wait, about 13 years to be exact. During that time, many feats in animation would be made. Walt Disney would come along and create revolutionary animated shorts such as the Alice comedies as well as the creation of Mickey Mouse. The first animated feature-length film with color would be produced, that being The Adventures of Prince Ahmed in 1926, of which is also the first surviving animated film. And thank God, because this video is already running long enough as is. Now, Cristiani would eventually return to the animation industry in a way, due to one notable thing. In 1928, Hipólito Yrigoyen would be re-elected for a second term as the president of Argentina, giving Cristiani a second chance to mock the dude for his mass amounts of presidential tomfoolery. So for the first time in more than a decade, Cristiani would sit down to create an animated feature film. But not just any animated feature film, but the first animated feature film to have synchronized sound via the Warner Bros. Vitaphone system. And soon enough, the world would be introduced to Peludopolis on September 16th, 1931. Yeah, I can never get out of 1931 in these videos, can't I? We circle our plot background to our good friend Yrigoyen, who this time is portrayed as a pilot sailing on his ship, the titular Peludopolis, which represents Argentina. While sailing to the island of Quesolandia, his boat is attacked by hungry and bloodthirsty sharks that represent the Radical Party in Argentina, representing the former president of Argentina, Marcelo T. de Alvear, and Yrigoyen stole the boat from him. Luckily, the boat is recovered by military forces once it's found that Yrigoyen is still up to his wacky antics once again. Oh, silly Yrigoyen, Argentine politics are for kids! Now, it's important to note that there's a lot less emphasis put on Yrigoyen in the film, and for good reason. A year into production, a military coup ousted and overthrew Yrigoyen from his presidential seat. Production would be halted on the film to make necessary changes to the plot structure, such as putting less focus on Yrigoyen in general and adding a moral center point character, Juan Pueblo, to keep things focused. Once the film was completed and released, it was quite ahead of its time like the other Cristiani projects. As mentioned before, this was the first animated feature film to feature the sound-on-film technology that was made possible by Vitaphone. This makes it the first animated film with synchronized sound, which made it a pain for Argentine theaters who weren't able to support the technology and thus couldn't play back the synchronized audio track. While I don't know the full degree of the success of Peludopolis, I can imagine it doing at least somewhat decent. Being the first animated feature film with sound is no feat to gawk at, and I can definitely see it as a big selling point that attracted people to the film. Yet even with the historic nature of the production, much like Cristiani's other filmography, the feature would not be preserved well in the slightest. All known copies of Peludopolis would be destroyed at the facilities they were stored in during two separate fires in 1957 and 1961. We actually do have more of this film than Cristiani's other work, as a making-of video for Peludopolis still survives and is currently viewable on YouTube. This gives us the only behind-the-scenes look of any Quirino Cristiani film whatsoever, and a fairly fun one at that. Various posters and production drawings can also be accessed easily online. It's tragic, really. Cristiani really did revolutionize the animation world with his films. Making these features at the time were no easy feat, especially when you were breaking molds such as the first animated feature film with sound. And the idea that these pieces of film history can just be lost just like that is an unfortunate reality we have to face. Yet his creations are just a drop in the bucket to the countless amounts of film history from this era that have been lost from fire or just poor preservation in general. Quirino Cristiani would create a few more films throughout the late 30s and early 40s, with his last being the short film Carbonata in 1943. He would then retire from filmmaking entirely and live the rest of his life until peacefully passing away on August 2nd, 1984 at the age of 88. Quirino Cristiani will forever be remembered as the guy who created some of the first animated feature films. Born out of a burning passion to criticize the Argentine government and the overboard shenanigans of its leader, he revolutionized the industry of animation and broke the mold for so many feats within it. Well, it's a shame that not much of his historic work survives. Legacy is important, and Cristiani's legacy is one that deserves much more recognition. We can trace much of our modern animation landscape to this one man and his work, which is incredible in itself. So thank you, Cristiani. Your work still inspires animation as a whole, as well as keeping these stupid YouTube videos engaging. Here's to you. We have one more animated film we are going to talk about today, and I was debating on whether I should include this film in here or not because A, this video is already going on long enough, and B, this movie wasn't even finished and released, instead being cancelled midway into production. But I figured that the rocky history of this film's production was intriguing enough to deserve a spot in here. So we all know who and what Pinocchio is, right? The iconic Italian children's book character and his misadventures has entertained kids for generations through his various adaptations, most notably notably the 1940 animated feature-length adaptation by Walt Disney. However, what you probably don't know unless you're a lost media wizard is that there was even an earlier feature-length animated film adapting Pinocchio that predated Disney's version by a few years. If it were released, it would have had the historical badge of being the first cel-animated feature-length animated film. Unfortunately, this version would never get off the ground and remains unfinished and unreleased forever. In 1935, the short-lived Italian animation studio Cartoni Animati Italiani Roma, or CIAR, was commissioned by Italian politician Alfredo Rocco to create a feature-length animated film based on the 1883 children's book by Carlo Collodi, The Adventures of Pinocchio. The film would have an estimated budget of 1 million liras, with plans to create around 110,000 drawings a year during production. The film was planned for international release in the fall of 1936. The movie would have been a fairly straightforward and faithful adaptation of the source material, with many events from the book being adapted and fully animated for the silver screen. It even borrowed the same name, The Adventures di Pinocchio, or The Adventures of Pinocchio. Despite the amount of faith and work that went into the project, production issues would almost immediately arise. CIAR hired many comic artists and illustrators that, while good at drawing scenes, did not have experience in animation, let alone an entire animated movie. This was made even more of a problem when you realize that cel animation was still a fairly new process for the time that did not develop a massive culture surrounding it. This put the animators into even more of a frenzy, as not only did they not know much about animation, they were working with a process that was very undeveloped and new. These technical problems would lead to CIAR completely running dry of money in a few years' time, leading to the movie to get completely cancelled and all of the work on it to be shelved. Yes, this movie had so many production issues that it single-handedly killed the animation studio behind it. What's interesting is that there are several rumors on what the fate of the film was after it was officially cancelled. These include the co-director Raul Verdini taking the original negative and trying to convert it to color unsuccessfully, as well as stitching together a short film from the completed work on the film and showing it in some Italian theaters in the late 40s. But these theories pale in comparison to the third and final theory, that being The Adventures of Pinocchio is actually the 1979 Nickelodeon show, by the way. Okay, the actual third theory is that Walt Disney actually bought the original negative to the film when it was cancelled to act as inspiration for their own animated feature-length adaptation of Pinocchio. It makes sense, considering that if the movie was actually released, it would have been a faithful inspiration to go off of when creating your animated adaptation a few years down the line. So hey, who cares if it wasn't finished? We'll just buy the unfinished work print. This theory thus implies that the movie is now in the possession of Walt Disney Productions. But hey, that's just a theory. A brave theory! Thanks for watching! The first animated feature-length adaptation of The Adventures of Pinocchio is still shrouded in mystery to many animation historians, with the film presumed to be completely lost since at least 1940. Only a few scattered production materials have appeared online since, including a few screenshots and production images. Not only is footage out of the picture, but general info is scarce to come by as well. We don't even know who exactly directed this film, as different sources say different people entirely. The Adventures of Pinocchio is definitely a film of many almosts. It was almost the first cel-animated feature-length animated film. It was almost Italy's first animated film in general. And it was almost the biggest adaptation of Pinocchio yet. While it's unfortunate to see the film unfinished and lost to time, at least we can take away an interesting story from conception to cancellation and everything in between. But for now, the 1936 adaptation of The Adventures of Pinocchio shall remain mysterious. So what shall we take away from these creators and their animated films that are just as historic as they are lost? Well, the idea of how these treasures in animation and film history can be lost due to their poor preservation is a strange and otherworldly thought that really sticks out to many people, myself included. After all, why would the first feature-length animated film become completely lost for the rest of time? Why wouldn't these features have better care put into their preservation? It's just the sad reality that comes from this era of film in general. Film preservation as a whole wasn't taken very seriously until at least the 1940s, let alone a whole film being made with an experimental process like animation that wasn't guaranteed to take off. So it was a shock to many that, once animation did take off as an important part of cinema, that these films did not survive the times whatsoever. But what did survive were the stories of the great minds behind these historic films. The people who pushed the limits provided by animation and broke many molds in the process. The stories of Charles-Émile in the Théâtre Optique, Pinto Colvig's animated creation, Quirino Cristiani's groundbreaking animated films, and the wacky tale of the cancelled animated adaptation of Pinocchio still live on today and are very inspiring from a historical perspective. As for finding these films, well, I honestly wouldn't hold your breath. As much as I would love to see a lost Théâtre Optique film resurface or for creation to be found in someone's private film collection, most of these films are at least an upwards of 100 years old. Not to mention that the films mentioned either had their only known copies destroyed by fire or neglect, or we don't even know where the copies ended up to begin with. I think it's fair that it's going to take a miracle if anything else surfaces from these movies, if it isn't impossible already. But legacy is important, and these people in their animated films have a legacy behind them that is nothing short of legend. And that is a legacy that I hope is never lost to time. So remember the names and the stories of the people who made animation and film history by creating the first feature-length animated films. Who knows, they might inspire you to make history just the same. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm sorry that this video took quite a bit of time to get out the door, because as you might know, I originally had a video which covered the comprehensive history of SpongeBob SquarePants deleted scenes, which if you've seen my last community post, it didn't really work out in the end and it definitely put my videos behind schedule, but I hope this longer video made up for all of the delays and setbacks. I definitely already have a few videos planned, some of which aren't Lost Media related by the way, so stay tuned everyone. So if you liked this video and you don't want to miss out on any of the wacky and tubular things coming to the channel, make sure to subscribe. Maybe give a little like, dislike, or comment, or whatever YouTube lets you do nowadays. Maybe go follow me on the weird bird app that everyone complains about too, because I post video updates there regularly. So anyways gamers, this has been Bray Bray, thanks for watching, and remember that Buff Yoshi is forever supreme.